Hello, my name is Angela Adsett, and my presentation today is on culturally grounded competitive advantage in Indigenous Economic Development Corporations, or EDCs. How EDCs can redefine their competitive arenas through culture. My research question is, how can Indigenous-owned economic development corporations develop a sustainable competitive advantage by redefining their competitive arenas through culturally grounded strategies? Indigenous economic development corporations are drivers of economic reconciliation and self-determination in many First Nation communities across Canada. Indigenous communities can challenge or counter assimilative forces by adopting Indigenous-led solutions focused on decolonizing business, entrepreneurial and economic development, practice, thought, and action, according to Colburn and Anderson 2020. For example, in my nation, the Tahltan Nation, we own the Tahltan Nation Development Corporation, or TNDC, with annual revenues of approximately $120 million. A percentage of those revenues are given to the community for their programs and needs. Without TNDC, the Tahltan Nation would still be in poverty. EDCs help address socioeconomic challenges and promote well-being in Indigenous communities. In the Tahltan Nation, revenues received from TNDC support education, housing, health, and community infrastructure, such as the recreation center. Often, socioeconomic purposes propel and guide EDC's operations. First Nation communities must focus on economic development to support the socioeconomic needs. My research will examine how EDCs can redefine competitive arenas through culturally grounded strategies to achieve sustainable competitive advantage. Culture is the mental framework that individuals use to give meaning to their work, and it matters because it shapes what opportunities EDCs are open to and how they measure potential. Lofthouse 2020. Culturally sustainable EDCs will include business models that enhance and support the values and traditions of their community rather than solely economic models. Swanson and Swanson, 2017. Very little literature addresses culturally grounded strategies to achieve sustainable competitive advantage of First Nations. I will endeavor to fill a gap in the literature in future research. The questions I will attempt to address in this paper are: how can culture shape the operations and strategies of Indigenous EDCs, and what are the barriers and opportunities for leveraging cultural around competitive markets? EDCs are the economic and business arm of a First Nation, Métis, or Inuit government, and are a major economic driver for Indigenous communities as the business arm of that community, according to the Canadian Council of Indigenous Business 2021. For example, TNDC was created to benefit the Tahltan Nation, and its goals are intended to align with the strategic goals of the three shareholders, who are the chiefs and their councils. The Tahltan Chiefs oversees Telegraph Creek and Dease Lake, and the Iskoot Chief oversees Iskoot, and the Tahltan Central Government. EDCs began in the 1970s, and as of 2015, over 250 EDCs are in operation, according to the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. These EDCs help develop the economies of their communities. As with any economic development organization, EDCs must be competitive to ensure their success. There are several theoretical perspectives on competitive advantage to explore EDCs. The resource-based view holds that organizations should use their internal resources for external opportunities, according to Barney, 1991. In my experience as a CEO of two EDCs and a board director of another, this is true in every EDC I've served. Their culture, the trust within their community and with the EDC, and their unique governance are all internal factors that are unique and inimitable to that specific nation's EDC. A pan-Indian approach to managing an EDC will not work, as each Indigenous community is unique and has its own culture and traditions. The dynamic capabilities theory is grounded in the RBV. It is both an extension and a reaction to the RBV's inability to interpret the development and redevelopment of resources and capabilities to address rapidly changing environments. Bleedy et al., 2018. Referring back to the unique culture, trust, and governance of Indigenous communities, there is an opportunity to adapt to change through the traditional knowledge systems in each community. Change is often referred to as a moving towards something new. But in Indigenous EDCs, this often means remembering, relearning, and returning to the old. Stakeholder theory or stakeholder thinking helps to understand and support three interconnected economic development challenges: how value is created and exchanged, the connection between ethics and capitalism, and how leaders can effectively and problem solve these two challenges. As First Nations hold the stake in their territory, they are the primary stakeholder. And as First Nations place more value on their community's well-being than on profit, this is where the tension and the opportunity lies. EDCs are developed to make a profit, but the drive to make that profit is to benefit the community first and then the individual. Institutional logics are the practices, beliefs, and assumptions and values derived from the regulatory, social, and cultural contexts in which individuals and organizations exist and how they shape the EDC and decision-making and evaluating opportunities. Capitalism is defined as an economic system in which investment in and ownership of the means of production, distribution, exchange of wealth is made and maintained chiefly by private individuals or corporations, especially as contrasted to cooperatively or state-owned means of wealth, according to the dictionary. The very definition of capitalism directly opposes an EDC's mandate, which is to take care of its community. The Ocean Blue strategy promotes creating new market spaces rather than competing in an existing industry, according to Strategy 2015. Indigenous communities are unique. Of the 630 plus Indigenous communities across Canada, not one is the same in every way. If the Blue Ocean strategy applies to mainstream economies, there may be even more of an opportunity for Indigenous communities to focus on this strategy. The importance of cultural identity, traditional knowledge, and land stewardship in EDCs cannot be overemphasized. The Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development study began in the mid-80s to help determine why some Indian tribes were achieving success and others were not. The study revealed 4 common success factors. Number 1, the local autonomy and sovereignty. Number 2, organizations that match the community's cultural values. Number 3, long-term strategic decision-making, and we call that 7 generations. And 4, strong, effective leadership who understand the importance of the culture and have the capacity to move business forward with these in mind. An EDC will be more successful if its culture matches that of the community it serves and its leaders recognize and implement that culture into the organization. Cultural identity can be used as a differentiator for competitive advantage. For example, Indigenous creative industries are raising interest internationally, according to Heritage 2024. Not only internationally, but locally, today's consumers specifically look for originality, ethically sourced products, and social impacts, and the story behind the product. EDCs can create a unique customer experience by normalizing cultural values in business interactions to build a non-reproducible or sustainable competitive advantage. In preparation for the following pillars for sustainable competitive advantage for Indigenous people, it's important to understand Aboriginal title and rights in Canada. Aboriginal title is the unique collective right to use and jurisdiction over ancestral territories based on long-standing land use and occupancy by Indigenous peoples and their ancestors, according to Aboriginal title. Aboriginal rights are held by Indigenous people not by virtue of the Crown granting the land or legislation or treaty, but because the Indigenous people have inherent rights and were once independent and self-governing across all the lands of Canada, according to the BC Treaty Commission 2024. Understanding these definitions will help to understand the foundation for the following sustainable competitive advantages that I will share. Indigenous communities can leverage their traditional territories for tourism, ecotourism, and resource management as a competitive advantage differentiator. In 2022, the Teltan Central Government, of which I was a board member, formed a tourism department to engage in ecotourism and to take advantage of the benefits such as work opportunities for its members and to protect the Teltan culture and traditions. They are not alone. TCG joined the Destination Canada, the Government of Yukon's Government of Tourism and Culture, Northwest Territories Tourism, a global consultancy firm, adjacent right holders, stakeholders, EDCs, and local tourism consultants to form the Northern Indigenous Tourism Lodge Network. As more Indigenous communities endeavor to guard and protect their traditional territories through ecotourism, their competitive advantage will grow. Indigenous groups also use their traditional territories for renewable energy projects as a competitive advantage. As of 2023, nearly 20% of Canada's electricity generating projects, most of which are renewable, were in partnership with First Nation communities and have more than quadrupled between 2009 and 2020 as more First Nation groups regain control over their traditional territories, according to the Government of Canada 2024. The First Nations Major Project Coalition is a nonprofit organization started and managed by First Nations across Canada that funds and supports many First Nation clean energy projects, including solar, hydrogen, geothermal, and wind. This competitive advantage will increase as more Indigenous groups fight to gain control over their territories and the demand for renewable energy grows. There are some challenges and barriers. The institutional barriers exist to developing sustainable competitive advantage for EDCs through culturally grounded strategies. One of the most common and well-known is systematic discrimination brought on by the Indian Act, which states that all reserve lands belong to the Crown, as mentioned before, and therefore all economic transactions on the land must be approved by the government, according to the Legislative Services Branch 2019. This barrier causes delays, disruptions, and loss of autonomy in developing First Nation territories and expanding EDCs. Policy misalignment is another barrier. As mentioned, capitalism sits in direct opposition to the mandate of EDCs. As the federal and provincial governments create all economic policies, it stands to reason that their capitalistic policies do not align with Indigenous EDCs. Because the Crown owns First Nation territories and Canada relies heavily on the extraction of natural resources, Indigenous communities have often no say about the projects initiated and or operated in their traditional territory and frequently experience negative impacts such as overforestry and open pit mines. For example, on Monday, August 4th, 2014, the tailings dam of the Mount Polley mine was breached, as I'm sure you've read, releasing water tailings and ground rock into Polley Lake, then into Hazelton Lake Creek, and then to Quesnel Lake, all in the northern part of the Secwépemc to the Quelimic traditional territory and within the traditional territories of the Williams Lake Indian Band and the Hatsuil-Soda Creek First Nation, of which I am the CEO of their Economic Development Corporation. Now, a decade later, that same mine has approved permits to increase the heights of that wall despite the protests of the surrounding Indigenous communities. Another negative impact of the Indian Act related to the economic development is that Indigenous people experience difficulty in acquiring funding for their projects as they don't own the land. The lack of capital suppresses economic growth as they do not have access to the financing markets that mainstream economies do. Without access to adequate capital, EDCs are more dependent on funding from funders whose values may not align with the cultural values of the Indigenous community. Indigenous communities place more importance on the well-being of their communities than purely economic growth and well-being or social determinant factors that are not easily measured. One example of the discrepancy between economic growth and economic development or community well-being is my own Tahltan Nation. TNDC has an annual revenue of approximately $120 million. Still, the impact of those revenues is not demonstrated quantitatively by reduced numbers of suicides and addictions, etc., or qualitatively in positive health, education, or social impacts, as well being in the communities of Dease Lake, Telegraph Creek, and Iskoot. There are still high levels of addiction, suicides, violence, lack of education, and poor health. There is an opportunity to better incorporate culture and traditional values into the community with the help of the added revenues. Indigenous communities and EDCs can differentiate themselves through cultural narratives. For example, Yukon First Nations LP, YFNT, is a consortium of 13 Indigenous organizations that believe Indigenous people are best placed to make decisions affecting their communities, primarily related to the critical gap in telecommunication services, to put the North on equal footing with the rest of Canada. Their strategic partnership is one example of many. The Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business has been instrumental in propelling Aboriginal business forward through diverse programming, providing tools, training, network building, major awards, and national events. In another example, 3 First Nations, the Katsi, the Kwantlen, and the Samanahu, which is right here where I live, in eastern Vancouver, formed the Sacred Waters development and began a residential project of nearly 1,500 homes. Strategic partnerships strengthen sustainable competitive advantage for EDCs. EDCs can position themselves as leaders, as keepers of the land, related to explicitly to protecting the earth from climate harm caused by human behaviors. The Indigenous Climate Hub is an online international Indigenous-led project to learn, share, and connect to discuss climate change and challenges and solutions. Despite the lack of infrastructure in many Canadian Indigenous communities, 75% of Indigenous businesses use online marketing tools to reach new customers at a higher rate than the average Canadian business, according to Canada 2025B. This familiarity with online marketing tools positions Indigenous businesses well for the international market. In response to the challenges of acquiring project funding, EDCs can focus more on community-driven funding models by reinvesting their profits into on-site training programs such as job-specific training and financial literacy to help build long-term capacity. Again, for example, in my Tahltan Nation, full funding and living support are available to any Tahltan member who desires to pursue a post-secondary or trades education. The funds for education come from the nation's clients, such as the mines, own source revenues, and the Tahltan Heritage Trust. Education is seen as the way forward. As there is very little research available on sustainable competitive advantage for EDCs, there is a great opportunity for further research in all or one of the available theories. A whole new area of research could even be possible. We have a need for culturally grounded business models and literature. EDCs challenge the neoliberal assumptions in business strategies, and there's future research in many of the Blue Ocean Strategy, stakeholder theory, and also Indigenous institutional logics. Systemic barriers exist, but EDC's cultural grounding, unique culture, tradition, and access to their traditional land base offer several non-replicable competitive advantages such as authenticity, community support, and sustainability by investing in their communities to build capacity and security for the future. EDCs can increase their footprint and control over their lands through collaborative partnerships and land-based innovative businesses. With the high level of online marketing with Indigenous businesses, the stage is also set for expansion into international markets. Thank you very much.